The sun was setting over the small, quiet neighborhood, painting the sky in soft pinks and oranges. It was the kind of evening where everything felt still, where most people were at home, winding down after a long day. But for Officer Rick, peace was never an option. He prowled the streets like a predator, his hands gripping the wheel of his squad car tightly, his eyes sharp, always searching for trouble. And in his mind, trouble usually meant someone who didn't look like him. Rick was known around the precinct as a man with a short temper and an even shorter fuse, especially when it came to people of color. His prejudice ran deep, and though he was supposed to protect and serve, Rick often did the opposite. He loved the power that came with his badge, especially when it gave him the excuse to harass those he believed didn't belong. As he cruised down the street, his eyes locked on a lone figure walking on the sidewalk. A young black woman, her long braids swaying gently as she moved, was minding her own business, headphones in her ears and a bag slung over her shoulder. She looked relaxed, her steps easy as if she had no idea what was about to happen. But Rick didn't see her as just another person enjoying the evening. No, to him, she was instantly suspicious. Why was she walking alone? What was she doing in this neighborhood? His heart started pounding, excitement mixed with the familiar surge of anger. In his eyes, she was up to no good. Without thinking twice, Rick slammed on the brakes, his car screeching to a stop just ahead of her. He leaped out, his heavy boots hitting the pavement with a thud. The woman, Tasha, paused, pulling her headphones out and glancing up with confusion in her eyes. She hadn't done anything wrong, but the way Rick looked at her, like she was some sort of criminal, made her stomach twist. "Hey you," Rick barked, his voice harsh, laced with accusation. He stalked toward her, his hand resting on the holster of his gun. "What are you doing out here?" Tasha blinked, startled by the sudden aggression. She opened her mouth to speak, but Rick cut her off before she could say a word. "Walking around here all by yourself, huh?" He was closer now, towering over her. His eyes narrowed as if he was trying to find something. "Anything wrong? You look like you're up to something. Got anything in that bag I should know about?" Tasha's heart started to race. She could feel the tension building, thick in the air. "I'm just walking home," she said, her voice steady but quiet. "I haven't done anything wrong." But Rick wasn't interested in her words. To him, her explanation didn't matter. He had already made up his mind about her, and it wasn't good. His face twisted into a sneer as he stepped even closer, his breath hot on her face. "Just walking home," he mocked, his tone dripping with disbelief. "I've heard that one before. How about you show me some ID?" Tasha frowned, feeling the knot of fear tightening in her chest. "I don't understand why you're stopping me," she said, trying to keep her voice calm. "I haven't done anything." Rick's patience was wearing thin. He didn't like being questioned, especially not by someone like her. "You don't understand, huh?" he snapped, his hand suddenly shooting out to grab her arm. His grip was rough, and Tasha winced at the unexpected force. "Let go of me," she cried, trying to pull away, but Rick's grip only tightened. Without warning, he shoved her against the side of his squad car, her body hitting the cold metal with a thud. Fear and pain shot through her all at once, but before she could protest, Rick pressed her face against the hood of the car, his other hand yanking her arms behind her back. Tasha's mind raced. How had this happened so fast? She was just walking home. Her thoughts scrambled as she struggled beneath his grip, trying to process the injustice of it all. She could feel the burn of tears behind her eyes, but she blinked them back, refusing to show him any weakness. "You think you can just walk around like you own the place?" Rick growled, leaning in close to her ear. His voice was low, almost a snarl. "You people are always causing trouble, and I'm not gonna let it slide." His words cut deep, and Tasha's fear morphed into anger. She knew what he meant by "you people." She had heard it before, felt it sting before. But this was different. This was worse. He wasn't just throwing words around. He was using his power to hurt her, to make her feel small, to crush her spirit. But despite the fear clawing at her chest, Tasha found her voice. "I haven't done anything wrong," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "You have no right to treat me like this." Rick laughed, a cold, hollow sound that echoed through the quiet street. "No right?" he repeated, tightening his grip on her arms. "I have every right. You're nothing but trouble, and I'm gonna make sure you pay for it." Tasha's heart pounded in her ears as she felt the weight of his words. The fear was suffocating, and yet, deep down, she knew this wasn't the end of the story. She wasn't powerless. She wasn't going to let him win. But for now, all she could do was wait, her body trembling against the car, as Rick tightened the cuffs around her wrists, sealing her fate for the moment. The world felt heavy with fear, anger, and injustice, but something told her that this was far from over. The cold metal of the squad car pressed hard against Tasha's cheek, her breath shallow as she struggled to stay calm. Her wrists throbbed from the tight cuffs, and her heart pounded wildly in her chest. She knew she had to keep it together, but the fear was creeping in, thick and overwhelming. "Why are you doing this to me?" Tasha asked, her voice shaking slightly but still strong enough to be heard. "I haven't done anything wrong." Rick stood behind her, rifling through her bag with little care for her words. His rough hands tossed aside her things, her wallet, a notebook, a few personal items. He barely even looked at them, as if he already knew what he wanted to find. Nothing. But to him, nothing still meant something. "Shut up," Rick snapped, ignoring her question entirely. His face was set in a scowl, eyes full of cold indifference as he continued his pointless search. He didn't care about her innocence. To him, it didn't exist. She was guilty because of what she looked like, and in his mind, that was all the proof he needed. Tasha's breath caught in her throat. She tried to stay calm, but it was getting harder with every passing second. She could feel the tension in the air, a storm brewing around her. The weight of the injustice pressed down on her like a heavy cloak. As Rick searched her things, the street began to shift. People were watching now. At first, just a few curious faces peeking out from behind windows or slowing their steps as they passed. Then, as Rick's rough handling of Tasha became more apparent, the crowd started to grow. A few people pulled out their phones, recording the scene. Others whispered to each other, their eyes filled with concern and uncertainty. Tasha could feel their eyes on her. She could feel their silent support, the weight of their presence giving her a small sliver of comfort. But none of them dared to step in. None of them moved forward to stop what was happening. The fear of authority, of Rick's badge and gun, kept them at bay. Still, their presence mattered. Tasha wasn't alone, even if it felt that way. She gathered her courage, steadying her voice, though it trembled just a little. "You don't know who I am," she said softly, but loud enough for Rick to hear. Her words were quiet, but there was strength in them, a warning that Rick didn't seem to catch. He snorted, glancing over his shoulder with a cruel smirk on his face. "Oh yeah," he mocked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Who are you, the president's daughter, or something?" Tasha swallowed hard, her heart still racing, but she kept her eyes on Rick. "I'm telling you, you don't know who I am," she repeated, her voice stronger this time. She wasn't boasting or threatening him. She was simply telling the truth. But Rick wasn't interested in truth. He only cared about the power he thought he held over her. The small crowd had grown larger now, the uneasy murmurs growing louder. Some people shouted for Rick to stop, sensing something was very wrong. The tension in the air was thick, pressing down on everyone like a heavy blanket, making it hard to breathe. The crowd knew what they were witnessing wasn't right, but still, no one dared to step forward. The fear of what could happen next kept them rooted in place. Rick ignored the growing calls from the crowd, his face twisted in a sneer as he leaned closer to Tasha, his voice low and menacing. "You think you're something special, don't you?" he hissed. "Well, guess what? It doesn't matter who you are. Out here, I'm the one in charge." Tasha's heart raced, but she refused to let the fear overtake her. She knew she was in danger, but something inside her told her that she had to stand firm. She had to trust that the truth would come out, that Rick's cruelty would not go unchallenged. But for now, she could only wait, feeling the tension coil tighter and tighter around her like a noose. Rick turned back to her bag, shaking it out angrily onto the hood of the car. Personal items clattered onto the cold metal. Her phone, some loose change, a few receipts, but there was nothing that could justify his actions. Rick's frustration grew as he found nothing suspicious, nothing to confirm the ugly assumptions in his head. The crowd murmured louder, and Tasha could hear snippets of conversations around her. "This isn't right," someone whispered. "He's going too far," another said. The unease in their voices mirrored the fear building inside her, but none of them dared to come closer. Rick's patience was wearing thin. He had expected to find something, anything, that could justify what he was doing, but there was nothing. His face grew red with frustration, and the crowd's quiet murmurs only fueled his anger. He straightened up, tossing the empty bag aside, as if it meant nothing. "Who do you think you are, telling me I don't know who you are?" Rick spat, his voice loud enough now that the crowd could hear. He wanted them to see his control, to remind them of his authority. "It doesn't matter who you are. You're in my hands now." Tasha's body trembled, not from fear, but from the sheer weight of the moment. She had done nothing wrong, and yet here she was, handcuffed and humiliated in front of a growing crowd. But deep down, she knew something Rick didn't. She knew that this wasn't over. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, some people calling out for justice, others recording every second on their phones. The air was thick with suspense, the tension almost unbearable, as everyone waited to see what would happen next. Tasha's eyes locked on Rick, and though her voice was quiet, it cut through the noise. "You're making a mistake," she said, her voice steady, but with an undercurrent of emotion. "You don't know who I am, but you will soon." Rick's face twisted into a cruel smile, but for the first time, there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. He turned to face the crowd, feeling their eyes on him, but his grip on power was starting to slip. Something was coming. Rick grinned triumphantly as he reached for another set of handcuffs, the metallic clink sending a chill down Tasha's spine. Her heart pounded in her chest, each second feeling like an eternity. She could feel the eyes of the crowd on her, their phones raised, documenting every cruel second of this humiliation. She had warned Rick, told him that he didn't know who she was, but he had only laughed in her face. And now, it seemed he was about to finish what he had started. His hands hovered over the cuffs, ready to snap them onto her wrists, but before he could lock her fate, something happened that no one expected. A sleek black car glided silently up the street, its tires barely making a sound as it came to a smooth stop just a few feet away from Rick and Tasha. The crowd, already tense, shifted, their murmurs turning into a hushed curiosity. Everyone's eyes were on the car, its tinted windows reflecting the fading sunlight. The air grew thick with suspense, the moment hanging in the balance like a taut string about to snap. The door of the car opened, and out stepped a man in a perfectly tailored suit, his shoes gleaming under the streetlights. He was tall, imposing, and moved with the quiet confidence of someone who was used to being in control. Beside him, two other men followed, equally well-dressed and serious-looking, their presence only adding to the gravity of the moment. Rick's hand froze midair as he watched the man approach, his smirk faltering for just a second. The man walked with purpose, his eyes locked onto Rick, but it wasn't a look of anger. It was one of certainty, like he already knew how this was going to end. "Officer," the man said, his voice calm but firm, cutting through the noise of the crowd like a sharp blade. He reached into his jacket and flashed a badge. "I suggest you stop what you're doing immediately." Rick blinked, momentarily stunned. He squinted at the badge, trying to make sense of the situation. "Who do you think you are?" Rick scoffed, though his voice wasn't as confident as before. You can't just walk in here and tell me what to do. I'm handling police business." The man's gaze never wavered. He stepped closer to Rick, his tone still composed, but with an unmistakable edge of authority. "You've made a terrible mistake, officer. A mistake that could cost you everything." Rick's bravado cracked slightly, but he wasn't ready to back down. "Not yet. Mistake? You're joking, right? She's the one in trouble here." He jerked his thumb at Tasha, who was still standing by the squad car, her wrists sore from the cuffs, her face a mixture of fear and hope. The man didn't even glance at her. Instead, he took another step toward Rick, his presence towering over the officer. "Do you even know who she is?" he asked quietly, his voice low but filled with weight. The crowd seemed to hold its breath, sensing the shift in power. Rick hesitated, a flicker of doubt crossing his face. "Why should I care? She's just—" But his words trailed off, the final bit of confidence draining from his voice. Now the man turned to Tasha, his expression softening for the first time since he arrived. Tasha's shoulders sagged in relief as she met his eyes, the tension that had gripped her body loosening ever so slightly. The man walked over to her, gently placing a hand on her shoulder. "Tasha," he said softly, his voice full of reassurance. "I'm here now. You're safe." Rick's eyes widened, confusion turning into something darker, panic. He opened his mouth to speak, but the man cut him off, turning back to face him with a cold stare. "Let me introduce myself," the man said, his voice calm but now filled with an undeniable authority. "I'm Special Agent Marcus Jennings. I work for the federal government, and you've just assaulted my sister." The color drained from Rick's face. The weight of those words hit him like a ton of bricks, his hands trembling ever so slightly as the realization set in. He had no idea who he was dealing with. Tasha's brother wasn't just some man in a suit. He was one of the most powerful federal agents in the country, a man with connections far beyond anything Rick could imagine. For a moment, there was complete silence. The crowd, now fully aware of the unfolding drama, was in stunned disbelief. Some gasped, others whispered to each other, and more phones were lifted, capturing the unfolding scene with renewed interest. Rick's once bold attitude crumbled in an instant. You're her brother," Rick stammered, his voice small and shaky. I didn't know. I thought." Marcus's eyes narrowed, his patience wearing thin. "You didn't care to know. You saw a black woman walking down the street and decided she was a criminal. You used your power to harass and hurt her, without a shred of evidence or reason. And now you're going to face the consequences." Rick's breath quickened, panic flooding his system as the crowd started to murmur louder, some shouting for justice, others still recording in stunned silence. He glanced around, the weight of his actions crashing down on him. He had overstepped, and there was no escaping it now. The tension in the air was thick, and Rick could feel it closing in around him like a noose tightening around his neck. He had always been the one in control, the one with the power. But now, that power was slipping away, faster than he could grasp it. Tasha, standing tall beside her brother now, lifted her chin. For the first time since the encounter began, she felt safe. The weight of the injustice she had endured still lingered. But now, standing beside Marcus, she knew it wouldn't last. She wasn't alone in this fight. The crowd sensed the shift too. What had started as a moment of fear and injustice was now turning into something different, something bigger. The tension in the air was palpable as Agent Marcus Jennings turned back toward Officer Rick, his calm demeanor hiding the storm brewing beneath his composed exterior. He motioned for Rick to step aside, away from the eyes of the crowd, away from the cameras that were capturing every moment of his disgrace. Rick, still pale and shaking, followed in a daze, his once bold arrogance now replaced by nervous uncertainty. Marcus leaned in close, his voice low but laced with a quiet menace. "You think you can treat people like this? You think you can abuse your power and get away with it?" His words were like ice, chilling Rick to his core. "You'll be lucky if you still have a job by tomorrow." Rick opened his mouth to protest, his words fumbling over each other. I didn't know. He started, but Marcus cut him off with a sharp look. You didn't care to know. Marcus said coldly, his voice steady. You didn't care who she was. You didn't care about her humanity. You saw a young black woman and decided she was guilty of something. Anything. Because that's how you operate, isn't it? Rick's throat tightened as he tried to swallow the amount of fear building inside him. His mind raced, searching for a way to explain, to excuse himself, but the weight of Marcus's words crushed every weak defense he could think of. The truth was clear, even to Rick. He had overstepped, and there was no talking his way out of this. Behind them, the crowd, once silent with fear and unease, had found their voices. Cheers erupted for Tasha, her calm defiance and quiet strength, inspiring those who had witnessed the injustice unfold. We're with you, Tasha, someone shouted from the crowd. Justice for Tasha, came another voice. The noise swelled, a powerful wave of support that carried Tasha and Marcus forward.